All right, welcome everyone to Just Ask Jen with our treasurer, Jennifer Wagner. We're gonna send it right over to her.
Thank you, Rob, and welcome anybody that's online with us tonight. Our topic for today is, have you ever wondered how Cincinnati Public Schools gets their funding? And so we're going to take a deep dive. I'm cramming like a college level course into 1 hour. So we're going to talk fast. If we have follow-up questions, we'll answer them at the next Just Ask Jen on December 3rd. I'm going to introduce my partners today. We have Brandon Craig. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. And, Brandon Craig, board member and chair of the Budget, Finance, and Growth Committee.
Yes, and we wouldn't survive without him. And we also have Michael Guston, Assistant Treasurer. Mike, you want to say hi?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Guston, Assistant Treasurer.
Thanks for joining us. And then we have on standby Kevin Ashley in case we get some deep level questions that we can't answer. So Kevin's our expert on state funding, and he does all our forecasting. So he's diligently working. Kevin, you want to say hi?
Sure. It's good to be with everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for joining, Kevin. All right, so let's just jump in. So let's start with the first slide. So this slide shows you a pie chart of all of our district revenues. So for fiscal year 25, we have about $823 million that we're managing, which is a lot. And we take our job very seriously. But we have three major areas of funding. First is our local property taxes, which is on everybody's mind. The second is the state funding, and we're going to do a little walkthrough on our state funding formula. And the third are our state and federal and other local grants. So the majority, as you can see on this pie chart, is the general fund versus all the state and federal grants. We get some money for food service. That's from the federal government. And we have to share some of our funding with the non-public schools. So you can see on the graph to the right, the table to the right, that there's about $14 million that passes through us to support Cincinnati resident students that go to non-public schools and require services. So we share it. So you also see this chart, little green chart of ESSER. ESSER's done, but we had some encumbrances that at the end of the fiscal year we needed to pay out, and our deadline was by September 30th. So, or actually by December 1st, because they extended it. But so we had about $29 million left to spend out, and we are spending every single penny they gave us. So that's good news. So next slide, we're going to dive into the general fund, and these are all the sources that come into the general fund. So the first two lines on the table to the right are our property tax. So we get about $360 million from our real estate and personal property tax, which is really utilities. The second two lines represent state funding. So we have unrestricted grants and aid is $129 million. We'll go into a little bit more detail on that in a future slide. And then we have restricted grants from the state, and we'll go into that detail as well. The property tax allocation of $29.6 million represents the on person's property tax bill. You get credits for homeowner, homestead, and rollback. And so the state reimburses us for that loss of income. So it's a credit on the property tax owner's bill, but we get the money from the state. So that's 29.6, and that's kind of being phased out. And then we have a big chunk of other operating revenue. We're going to dig into that as well, because it doesn't look very transparent. And then advances in is just a temporary movement of money, of cash. We can't end a year and having any of our state and federal grants in a deficit. And they become in a deficit because we spend the money first and then we ask for reimbursement. So the last month of spending the reimbursement comes in July. So the general fund has to temporarily move money to cover that. And then we just turn around and bring it back in. But it goes out as an advance out, as an expense, and it comes back in as an advance in as a revenue. So they just offset each other 1 year to the next. All other financing sources is really prior year reimbursements, and that $4.3 million is our E-rate money. So on your telephone bill, you get taxed for your telephone usage. That money is to go to technology in schools and school libraries, or public libraries, sorry. So so that's a beautiful, so on the left, the chart shows you the blue colors really come from local sources. The green colors come from the state. And then the other colors come from the different areas that we'll go into and just on the next slide. Thank you, Rob. So here's that big other operating revenue. And this is where our community reinvestment agreement, the payment in lieu of taxes. So commercial properties get an abatement for an improvement. We get our share through we have to build these and then collect the money. And so that represents about $12.7 million per year. And then the revenue in lieu of taxes is the TIF money, which stands for tax incremental financing, not incentive. I made a typo there. But so when a TIF district has an abatement, they pay their normal rate. The city puts it in a separate fund to use to help improvements on that project. But we still get, and they give us our share. So that's about $33 million a year. I know I jumped in the middle of that table. So tuition at the top represents preschool tuition. And if we have out-of-state students that attend one of our schools, we get to charge them tuition as well. So it's about $2 million a year. Transportation is just lost passes and we have to replace them. So we collect some money to do that. I combined the investment interest earned, dividends, and the gain on sale, $2.3 million. And that really kind of depends on what the market's doing. How much money we can take out of our operating cash account and put it in investment accounts. The classroom and material supplies is just fees and reimbursements on lost devices. And then rental income. So if an organization comes to one of our schools and wants to rent it out for a weekend event, then that's where the income goes. Donations to private source. We had to actually dive into that because I couldn't remember what it was. But it is the cell phone tower revenue that comes in from Pleasant Ridge cell phone tower. And then we talked about property tax exemption and revenue in lieu of taxes already. The $4 million on federal reimbursement is our Medicaid, and that usually lags 2 to 3 years behind. So we spend a lot of money. We file in supporting of our students. We do some filings, and then the federal government reimburses us for Medicaid-related services. So it's about $4 million. And then other miscellaneous is we have deals with our collective bargaining agreements where we pay their staff and then they reimburse us for the cost. So the revenue, when they reimburse us, is booked as a revenue. And then when we pay them, it looks like an expense, but they're offsetting. So in total, that's $56 million of our total general fund budget. Next slide. So local property taxes. So this comes from a report from Hamilton County. You can look on their website. It's a real estate settlement statement that came out in September. So it's really talking about the calendar year of 2024. So property taxes are collected on a calendar year. We operate on a fiscal year for June 30. But this report doesn't break it down by fiscal year, so I'm giving you calendar year. It's pretty similar. So in total, 417 million. And you can see the general, what they call general of 216.7 million or 6 million is the current expense continuing levies and the inside millage. Then we have 3 fixed sum levies that the voters have approved. So regardless of what happens, we get the amount that the voters approved, the dollar value. And then we have the bond levy that started years ago to help fund the facility master plan. That brings in about $29 million a year. And that goes right into the bond fund. And then, so the next levy that's coming up for renewal is the $48 million. That's on a 5-year cycle. The other 2 are on 10-year cycles. And the next one that comes up is the $65 million one, and that comes up in 2028, I believe. Okay, so, but you can see just kind of the breakdown that half of our property taxes come from continuing levies, and the other half come from termed levies or fixed sum levies. And so we have to always come back ask for renewals. Next slide. This division becomes important with the Senate Bill 308, where if you go to the next slide, I think it shows a little bit better. So this is what I call an inventory of our levy cycles. So we have inside millage 4.19, and that's defined by the county. And then we have 7 fixed rate levies that the voters approved. You can see the years in which they were approved. Those are continuing. And then the next two columns, you can see the voted millage, which is what was on the ballot. So in 1976, the voters approved a 7.3 mil levy, and it generated a bunch of money. Well, because of House Bill 920, what they call the House reduction factor, so it prevents property tax bills from growing with inflation automatically. So as property values go up, they reduce the millage so that that particular levy collects about the same amount the voters approved. The exception is we get money for new construction, so that gets added on. But you can see the voters approved a 7 mil levy, and the effective millage for residential properties is down to 2 mils because the values went up. And the third column is the commercial and industrial properties is a little bit higher. So when they do the billing, they do a blended rate. Over to the right side, you show the fixed sum levy, the 3 fixed sum levies, and that what their millage is, and their dollar values don't change regardless of property value. So as values go up, the millage goes down. As values go down, the millage goes up to collect the same amount of money that the voters approved. And then I'm showing you the bond levy. So we had a total millage of all levies of 67.8. And our effective residential is 41. Effective commercial is 49. So I referred to Senate Bill 308. So the state says that every school district has to have at least 20 mills to operate. That's a floor. So the stuff that's on the right side of the screen doesn't apply to this calculation. The stuff on the left side, the current expense millage does. So they're subject to the 20 mil floor. So you see where they approved 41 million, but our residential is at 15.9 and our effective commercial is at 23. The blended rate of that is 17, which has dropped below the 20 mil floor. So they automatically increase the millage on everybody's property tax values, bills, to get us back up to the 20 mils. So Senate Bill 308 wants to put the fixed sum levies on the right side into that calculation, which means we would lose the revenue that's generated from going from 17 back up to 20 because our combined levy millage would be much higher than the 20 mil floor, if that makes sense, everybody. That would represent about $10 million of annual revenue that we would lose. So we are fighting that through a resolution and a letter writing campaign. Okay, next slide. Making sure I'm keeping up on my notes. So on the one screen where I talked about other revenues, I showed the 2 big values of the community reinvestment agreements. We have 430 active agreements that represent 423 parcels. 368 of those agreements are at the old rate under the old agreement at 25% billing. And the new ones, the 62 under the new agreement, are at 33% millage. And the anticipated revenue back on that sheet was $12.7 million. So on the tax increment financing, we have 7 municipalities that participate in this for an annual revenue of 33. I showed you the list, there's 7 of them. And then I broke down Cincinnati has TIF districts. There's 36 TIF districts, which sounds like the entire city. And then they also have TIF projects. So a project would be like MedPace is a project. So that would be abated, but we would get our 33 or our 25% because that was under the old agreement. So that's how that revenue is generated. Next slide, please. So you remember all the other local funds that were on that pie chart represented about $5 million. That's like 0.6 of our revenues, but that's made up of Fund 9. So if you think of a fund accounting system, every fund has basically its own savings account or bank account, so to speak. If you think about it that way, it's its own set of books. So Fund 9 is for uniform school supplies, and that money is to be used across for each school across the whole population. So you can't just say, I want to pay for the senior prom because it only applies to the seniors. Adult education is just for some small fees of $600. Fund 18 is for public school support, and that is when you see going through the treasurer's report, donation for the principal's discretion. So that money gets deposited in Fund 18. Fund 19 is, I want to donate money to pay for this field trip, the kids to go to the zoo. So it's a very specific purpose. It's designated. So Fund 19 gets its own little special cost center, and that money can only be applied to that event or that purpose. And then we have student activities fund. So kids go on a field, they go on some event and the parents have to pay a fee to help pay for it. Or they go to Andros Islands for Clark. That money goes through the 300 account. There is a series of 200 accounts that are also student activities. I haven't included any of this because the money, we're just pass-through agents. The money belongs to the students. We're just holding agents. So like the senior class fund or the, I don't know, tennis club, they have their own monies. That is the money's owned by the students and not by the district, but we are the fiduciary agent. So I haven't included any of that in here. Okay, next slide. So I'll pause there for questions before we get into state funding and state and federal grants. So do we have any questions on the basics of where the district gets their money?
Yeah, Jen, we have two questions so far before we continue on. One of them, the first one is what options does the district have if this bill passes in the state?
If the bill passes, we have no options. We're going to have to cut our budget because our revenues are going down. So we can't, we don't have cash reserves enough to cover that loss. We'd have to make some significant reductions in our spending.
And would there be any options to bring in new revenue in the future?
So options for new revenue would be to put something on the ballot, a new levy on the ballot, asking for new money, either through an operations levy, like a fixed sum levy, or we have what we call PI levies, which are permanent improvement. And that can only be used on assets that have 5 years or more. So you would want it. So we're talking about a facility. In Finance Committee, you're going to see a presentation on the the facilities repair plan, which is about $170 million over a 5-year period. We can't absorb that in our operating budget, so we're going to have to go ask the public for support. And we can do that through a bond levy, we can do it through a permanent improvement levy, or we can do it through another operating levy. Those are the conversations we're having with the board.
One additional thought, Jen, on that is the other ways to bring revenue traditionally is in, assets, sale of assets or these type of things, which we don't have enough of to cover that loss, even in a one-time situation. So what you would likely see is this, if 308 is passed, a multiple effect. If we have to cut our revenue, cut our expenses and then redesign how we're operating schools or how we're operating programs, because there are very few things that we can cut. So it's a realistic thing that we can't really draw into a round of revenue from our assets that we would be losing from 308's passage.
And it would affect a lot of districts. Mike, do you remember how many 400 districts out of the 613 are on the 20 mil floor? Is that right?
Yeah, over 400 are on the 20 mil floor.
Yeah. So that would impact quite a few districts. So we're hoping that everybody stands up and says, no, we don't want this. So talking to our legislators. Good question though. Okay, what's your next one?
Yeah, the other question is can you explain a little bit why tax revenue grew so much, property tax revenue grew so much in the last year, and what that how that change took effect?
Yeah, so a couple things. The biggest thing is the triennial update on property values. So Cincinnati Public Schools is one of 13 taxing entities on a Cincinnati residents tax bill. So as the property values go up, you remember I said there's House Bill 920 that makes the reduction factor go down. So the other impact would be But the other 12 entities, if they have different kinds of levies, their costs could go up. The other challenge is on our fixed sum levies. It depends on how many taxpayers are in the pool. So if people jump out of the pool through abatements, then everybody else's taxes have to go up to make up that money. But if more people join the pool, if their agreements expire or there's a new construction, then that makes everybody else's taxes go down. So it's a combination of things, but just in general, our 3-year average of assessed value went up by $1.8 billion. So $1.8 billion is 35%. The assessed value is 35%. So 1.8 divided by 0.35. Well, I don't know if that worked out, but and I don't want to say the wrong amount. I have it somewhere in a file, but do you remember, Mike, how much the total value went up? Was it 9 trillion?
9 trillion is the total
Is the new-
assessed, it's a new value, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the 3-year average went up by 1.8 billion, which is a lot of money. So it's not, Cincinnati Public Schools is the largest share of all the taxing entities, but we're not the only. And so only our fixed rate levies would go up and then add on new construction. The fixed sum levies doesn't change for us in revenues. It might change independently up or down with how different neighborhoods might be valued. Somebody in one neighborhood tax bill might go up, while other ones, somebody else would go down. So it's hard, it's really complicated.
Yeah, I think an important part of an individual's tax bill is how much your property's worth relative to everybody else. And I think that's a huge thing, especially for
Right.
fixed sum levies. You know, if we only had 10 properties in the entire county for the $48 million levy, everyone owes $4.8 million, right? If you had 1 million properties, everyone owes $4.80. So,
Right.
but it's very much about, you know, the relative value.
One thing with that as well, in certain communities, what we have seen a pattern of is where there's an abatement or other ways of drawing the value of the property out. The assessed value for the properties that are still remain within that pool. So for instance, the house down the street from you gets abated, renovations, its value goes up, thereby your value goes up, but the taxable value has not changed. And so for some, they are seeing that growth from that as well, where the, to Mike's point, the comparatives around them, but also the comparatives of what's taxable within your local community and when some of those will roll off, because I do think we have a few of those that are going to be rolling off in the next year or two from early 2000s abatements that were done, that will have an interesting view on how their share of the taxable income from, or the share of the tax for the individual owners would be comparatively.
So also, other things that would influence that would be the rate of delinquencies. So if there's a high rate of delinquencies, everybody else has to pitch in more. And then also the reimbursements for people who challenge their value. And so they get money back, and then that means everybody else has to kind of cover that money on the fixed sum levy, so only half of them. But then, like I said, we're only one of 13 taxing entities, so some of the other taxing entities might have a big impact on their tax bill as well. It's a good question, though.
Thank you.
That could be
Thank you, General.
that could be an entire Just Ask Jen in itself.
all by itself. That's right. Thank you. Jen, that's all we have for the moment. You want to keep going?
Yep, please, because we're getting ready to go for a wild ride for state funding. Like my car, speedy car. Okay, so this is really complicated, and I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. So flip to the next slide. So the state funding formula that was adopted several years ago, and was developed by Representatives Cupps and Patterson, and then there was a whole big group of people that helped do it, is based on trying to go to student-based funding, and so it's a good start, but it wasn't fully funded, so it was only phased in. The funding was only phased in over a 6-year period. So the first 2 years, I think we lost $60 million in revenues because of the phase-in. So the funding formula is based on the numbers and the conditions of the students. It only funds K through 12 plus preschool disability, students with preschool disabilities, and that's about 260 kids. The last time I looked. It calculates a district's base cost to educate one child, one student. And it uses, for the number of students, the higher of the last year's enrollment or the average, the last 3-year average. So whichever's higher is what they use. So if you're a district in declining enrollment, it's typically better to use the 3-year average than the last year. Okay, so then it takes those numbers and it calculates the number of teachers and school staff and district staff that are needed that they will fund based on the standard ratios. The problem with this is they use district-wide numbers and we have numbers that spread across 66 buildings. So you're losing some efficiencies in that calculation. It also uses average statewide salaries and related benefits. And so some comparative data, we looked it up today. So the average statewide, I have it listed here somewhere. The average statewide teacher salary is, where did I write it, Mike? 97, no. Hold on. I wrote it down on a piece of paper.
I can tell you our districts, but I don't remember.
Oh, it's on the state report. So let me just put real quick. Okay. It's on one of the reports I ran today, and I have like a huge stack of papers. So suffice it to say that our average teacher salary compared to the state is much higher. So it was like 67,000 versus what's our average salary? 97?
83.
83. That's right.
Yeah.
And so it went to principals. And the same thing with our principals and assistant principals. The spread from the average to what we pay is much higher. Now, we have to pay market rate because we're competing against local districts, but across the state, the costs are much lower. So that's another weakness in the state funding formula. So, but this formula calculates for Cincinnati Public Schools that our base cost is $8,100 per student, $8,000 to educate a student. And it is then reduced by what they call our local capacity. So because we're considered a wealthy district, I'm gonna go through this math in a little bit. They say we can raise $5,110 per student. So that means they only have to pay $3,000 per student, which is only 36%, 36.9%. Last year, our state share was 42.1. So property taxes went up, property values went up, our state share goes down opposite. So everybody thinks we're getting all this grand money, but we're getting some, but it just gets off. We get less money from the state every year. So once they do the base, then they add on what's called the categorical funding. And so if this is posted on board docs, and I'm not sure it is yet, but we will, or we'll post it somewhere on the website. If you click the link, you can look at the categorical funding and the restricted funding. And then some of the other state reports, or you can find this on the state Ohio Department of Education website. Go to the financing page and you can look at all of these reports. They're just grand. Okay, next slide. I'm not going to go into the details of all those things because we don't have enough time. So here's the phase in for the formula. The first year they did 16%, then 33, 50. This year we're at 66.66%. And then in the next biennium budget, if they happen to agree with the phase in, they'll continue on phasing it to 100%. Next slide. So why is the state only paying 36% or 37% for each child? And this is the math. So on a per student basis, they calculate the per student value of our assessed valuation, and that represents 60% of the formula. Then they look at gross income. It's an average over a 3-year period. That represents 20% of the formula. Then they calculate median income, which is indexed to the 41st district in the state. I'm not sure we understand the formula, but that's what they do. And that's also 0.2%. And that comes up with what our local capacity is. So it's looking at our property wealth and our income. So for CPS, the average per pupil assessed valuation is $146,000. Our gross income and average per pupil is 74,000. I have a typo in there. Then the median income is 38,000. So you multiply the 146 times 0.6, you add it to the 74 times 0.2 and the 38 times 0.2, and you come up with $259,402.47. 63%, which is our share, represents 5109. So they subtract that 8101 minus 5109 gets to their $3,000 per student. Here's a link to the capacity calculation if you so choose to dive into that detail. Next slide. So on the state funding formula, I looked at August 1st, because right now they're switching over to actual, and we have some reporting and cleanup to do, so it looks weird. But so this is can think of this as the budget. So we had funded ADM at 32,808. So remember, that's K-12 plus preschool disabilities. So our regular ed preschoolers are not funded by the state, at least through the formula. So it calculates a base cost of 83 million, targeted assistance, special ed, restricted funding. We'll go into more detail on the next slide. Transportation reimbursement, 12 million, and then 6.5 million. So $18.78 million the state pays us, and our budget's like $45 million. And then preschool education, special ed is 2.1. So that's preschool disability students. So state aid is $157 million a year. Next slide. This shows you the restricted fund. So what that means is the money that comes in the formula that's restricted to these lines, we can only spend on those efforts, and they review our spending before they reimburse us. So they make sure that English language learners, $1.8 million is spent on English language learning accepted expenses. Student wellness. So remember, several years ago, Governor DeWine created a student wellness grant, and we got $12 million a year. Well, then they stuck it in the formula, and now it's subject to the state share. So now we're only getting $4 million a year. So that was an $8 million cut, like that. And we just had to figure it out. So we threw all that stuff into ESSER, and now ESSER ended, and so we had to shave some of that stuff back. But we spend $1.8 million on English language learners. And don't take this as a criticism or a complaint, because I have an English language learner daughter. But we only get 1.8 million. We spend about $12 million a year because our population of English language learners are growing, and we love them. We want them to come, but they're not being fully funded or supported by the state. Gift is 1.5, career tech education is 1.4. Here's another thing that's not funded well by the state. We spend $9 million a year on career tech education. We get 1.4 from the state and 1.6 from the federal government. So our restricted funding is $30 million. And the source of this is that August #1 payment. Next slide. Any questions on the state funding formula?
Yeah, Jen, our first question for that is how will the political climate now in Ohio and in the nation affect the state funding formula? Are we expecting major changes? Are we concerned about that?
We are concerned. I don't think the formula is going to change with new political people putting in place. I think they need to work on the wealth factor, though, because when you compare Cincinnati to Cleveland, our students are basically the same size, and the conditions are pretty close. But they get 73% from the state. We get 36% from the state. Doesn't seem very fair. The reason is because we have so much more property wealth than they do. But that just means that we have the ability to go raise more money locally. What concerns me is the movement to choice across the state, and we welcome competition. We can outperform people. We're not all held to the same standards, and that's what concerns me the most, because the more money they divert to these other non-public, non-CPS school districts for competitive reasons or choice, without the same accountability, then like, for example, we are required for all of our teachers to take our English language teachers take science or reading stipends. I don't know that that's the same requirement in any of the other schools. So it's money you pay and they're supposed to reimburse us, supposed to, but we have to lay the money out first. It's $2.3 million. So we're just not held to the same rules. And so that's concerning, but I don't think the state funding formula is going to change much. And I think they'll continue to fund it in the phase in that they've committed to.
One quick add-on thought, Jen, to that
Yeah,
is that I do think where we're going to potentially see the concerns is the movement towards, and you mentioned it with the amount of properties that we have and the sheer value of the property that we have as a community, we extend beyond just the city of Cincinnati. And the way that development has been encouraged, the way that some of the efforts to truly invest in cities like Cincinnati, in the core, but also in these suburban areas that are still within our district, what you will see is likely an increased valuation up to a point. I mean, I think there's a point where we will kind of, but you don't see the same increase in wealth of the individuals who live within the district. And so what I do worry about is this encouragement or this movement towards continuing to increase the value of property and to use property so tied to the value of whether or not you're a wealthy city or not, will have us in a position where we won't have true representation of the folks who are attending our schools versus the folks who live within our
right.
taxing district. But the other one is the increased number of students who the increasing movement of students with disabilities and ELS and multilingual learner students into urban communities, specifically large urban communities, will have a higher concentration of those resources without the state's formula actually accounting for that variation in a true way.
Right. Because they do require supplemental services and some support that other students don't need. So that was a great point. Thank you. Mike or Kevin, did you have anything to add to that concern about future?
The only thing I will say is it is a biennial budget. So
Right.
every 2 years, the folks in Columbus get a new chance to change
Right.
things around for us. So it does make it hard as we forecast, as we get ready to do our 5-year forecast and forecast into the future. Those changes in law have a huge impact on our revenues.
It's a good point. Very good point. Yeah. So, yeah, it's hard when they change things. I think I've had 4 different formulas in the last 9 years to deal with. So, things change every couple of years. It's hard to predict. I know that wasn't a great question or a great answer to your question, but those are the things to look out for.
Thank you, Jen. The second question is, does the state formula take into account inflation, cost increases to building construction, things of that nature as well?
So the state formula, I think every 2 years they update the average salary, the cost factors, or at least they did 2 years, like the last biennium budget. So it tries to take into account inflation, but you just never know if the statewide is equal to what you're experiencing in your own district. We used to have a formula that had a factor, the cost of business doing factor. So it would adjust based on your area, but what your economics in the area were. And so you would boost up a little bit just for those reasons, but the state funding formula is just statewide average salaries and other cost factors like that, like the benefits and was there a second part of that question?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay.
Jen, I think the other part to that also, though, is that by not necessarily thinking about urban's different in that sense, I think you mentioned it earlier, the competitive nature of what we have to pay in order to keep teachers within the space means that our cost of living increases are not just a factor of the general world cost of living increase, but it's a market-based cost increase. And so, in some areas where you do not have competitors within the immediate community, your cost of living increases may not be the same reflection as the large urban districts are facing.
Yeah. And our revenues, we looked at this a couple weeks ago, our annual revenues have not kept up with the inflation rates that we've had in the recent past. So that just means we have to cut more and more to stay within our means. So good question.
This is Kevin. One thing I do recall that we looked at recently was the state's money going to public school funding this year has actually gone down for all districts. But in particular for urbans, it had gone down even more. So just kind of keeping that in mind. But part of that is the opposite effect of the taxes going up is
Mhm.
driving down the state funding pool.
Right.
But just keeping that in mind, I think that's an important fact. And you hit on that earlier, Jen, when you mentioned that there's like an opposite effect. But I thought that was, and we'll maybe cover that a little more when we do the forecast about how the state funding dollars have actually gone down this fiscal year.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so if you recall, if you saw me in public in the month of July and August, communicating that we lost about $8 million in revenue because the state share went from 42 down to 36. And so that was a huge hit to our budget. Okay, so let's keep moving.
Yep,
'cause
that's all
it's-
the questions I have for now. So
It's okay. All right, state and federal grants. Go ahead and hit the next slide. So we have a series of state grants, and you can see their fund numbers, a series of 400. So if you ever see anything in the treasurer's report with a 400 fund number, you know it comes from the state. And so some of our funds have to be shared with our non-public partners. So Fund 401 is what's called the auxiliary fund, and that's $8 million. It goes right directly, it's just pass-through funding. We manage all the accounting stuff, but they get to spend the money on those students. But they're the Cincinnati resident students. So if they're a Catholic school that's in Green Township and they have kids from Northwest and kids from Oak Hills, this money only gets spent on Cincinnati residents. So then we have a state fund to support preschool, early childhood. And then we have a bunch of other, what they call other. So they're all in Fund 499, but they're separated by special cost centers. And I won't go into each and every single one of them, but you can see they're kind of little, they're competitive, and they're for specific intents. So in general, we get $3.5 million, $3.4 million from the state. And the non-public gets $8 million from the state for these funds. Next slide. So we're switching to our federal grants. These are the Title I grants. So you hear everybody talk about Title I as a holistic thing, but it's really 5 sub-grants. The largest being Title I-A, which is to support disadvantaged children. That's $25 million. Non-publics get an additional $3.8 million. So what's one of the funds that we share with the non-publics. And then neglected, delinquent, those are very targeted funds for specific students. Expanding opportunities for each child is less than $1 million. And then our McKinney-Vento, which is our homeless, $474,000 per year. So Title I, we get 27 million, non-publics get 3.8, for a total of $30 million just in Title I. The next slide goes into the other federal grants. Thank you. So we have Aspire, which is formerly GED funding, so adult education to get their diplomas, $1 million. Impact Aid is really a reimbursement for lost taxes based on federally owned property that we have in the district. That's about $100,000. Idea B is to be placed, to be used specifically on students with disabilities above and beyond what the general fund funds. So assistive technology, extra occupational therapy that goes above and beyond. So about $10.6 million a year, and 1.3 goes to the non-public to support our students with disabilities. We have a little parent mentor project. Carl Perkins is for career tech. It's 1.2 million. Oh, that's even smaller. I thought it was 1.6. So, and then Head Start is the federal grant that supports early childhood and preschool. It's $4.5 million. And then Title I non-competitive supplemental. Those are individual school grants for almost $2 million. And they get to spend their money according to those particular supplemental intervention support for students. Next slide. So continuing on, we have Title III, which has 2 grants, $500,000 for English language learners. Immigrants, 59,000, not a lot. Title IV, which used to be called Safe and Drug-Free Schools, is now for student support and enrichment to go along with the movement into social emotional learning, 1.8 million. We have another grant for early childhood, but this is specifically for students with disabilities at the preschool level. And then Title IIA used to be called class size reduction, and then it went to professional development, and now it's called supporting effective instruction. So little nuances, 1.8 million. And then we have some other federal grants of 900,000, and that used to be like the 21st Century Grant. So they're very small targeted funds. But in general, our federal grants, 51.8 million, and the non-public at 6.2 additionally. So about $58 million comes from federal grants. We have a Just Ask Jen I think it's in January. Nope, February. We're going to go into a deep dive of federal grants. And so you can save those questions for then, or you can send them in and we'll make sure we have answers for them on those presentations. But the next one is all about levies. So we're going to be talking about all the different kinds of levies and when they're renewing, what their options are, what their uses are. And so we can get into that in December. And then January's topic is breaking down the district budget. So what do we spend our money on? How do we allocate it out? What's it used for? And so we'll go into a bunch of deep dive, and we'll have lots of questions on that as we build our budget. I'm really looking forward to the April one. We're hoping to invite some legislators to come sit with us, and we can ask them questions about how they impact funding. I think it'd be really fascinating. So we're hoping to get that committed on April Fool's Day. So that'll be fun. Okay, so next slide. Wanted to introduce we're launching a new series.
So Jen, before we kick off real quick, President Bolton left a comment for us on Facebook, and thank you, President Bolton, for watching. We appreciate it. So we wanted to share that real quick.
Thank you.
Excellent point regarding Cleveland comparison and poverty. Ironically, the wealth factor makes us poor. The city's development plan is actually counter to CPS's needed growth. Universal vouchers are coming from the same state education line item as CPS money. So just a comment from our board member, President Bolton. We appreciate her watching. So Jen, sorry, you want to?
No, thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Bolton. We appreciate your always support and always fighting for our kids. You've been a long-term supporter. We appreciate that. So this slide, we're introducing a new series called Did You Know? So we're trying to keep educating the public on finance stuff. We can't get all the topics into Just Ask Jen, or I would be doing them every week instead of every month. So we're starting to write a series of little small snippets called Did You Know? And if you click on that link, Rob, it shows you where it is on the website. So if you go to the district's website and you click down and look at financial information, and then you click to the videos and newsletters over to the right at the bottom. So scroll up just a little bit, the other way, other way, scroll down. Okay, stop. So just to the right above that pie chart, there's a little snippet called Did You Know? And this first one is called, scroll up a little bit. Did you know? So Ohio school funding. So it's a little bit about Ohio school funding. And then we have a whole list of ideas, 12, 15 topics that we're going to write out. We're going to post them every couple of weeks. So just keep an eye out, come to this website. And then we're asking our board members to post them on their social media. And so we can start keeping the education of financial information flowing constantly so that our taxpayers can be well informed about all of our issues and the facts about school finance. And so I'm really excited about that new Did You Know series. So keep reading, keep learning. We appreciate everybody's participation. Do we have any other questions, particularly around state or federal grants? I didn't pause there. No,
All right, if I can chime in on state and federal grants,
please.
just
That'd
to
be great.
remind people that, your federal grants, especially Title I, Title II, Title IV, are supplemental to whatever the district provides. So there are very clear rules about, we call it the supplant rule, that these funds can't just be spent to replace what are general fund things, but are there to add additional non-core items to instruction. So,
And they're very strict, and we have to spend the money, we submit reimbursement, and they review all of our expenses to make sure they're in compliance with the purpose of the spending. And they question us on a regular basis. Plus, we get audited every year. But yeah, supplemental supplant is always a hard thing for people to understand when they're trying to spend money to support their kids.
yeah, so tune in for, is it February? And we'll we'll
Yep.
spend some time on supplement versus supplant for sure.
Yeah.
And Mike or Jen, just real quick, can you also share the fact that when we talk about these federal grants, we're not talking about the fact that those revenues come right away. So it is part, we are dealing with reimbursements as opposed to.
Right.
Right. And it's really it's a thread that runs through this whole presentation. Like, remember when Jen talked about advances, the reason we advance money to the federal funds is because they work on a reimbursement basis. So we pay the money, we pay the money out, we submit something called a project cash request back to get the money back, and then they pay us. And so, although anyone who's looked at the finance committee, the monthly report, you always notice our federal funds are in the negative, as they should be, because we're waiting reimbursement.
And it's usually, but so we close the month at the end of the month. It takes us probably 2 weeks to get everything done. We submit for reimbursement by the end of the second week, and then it takes 2 weeks for them to reimburse us. So it's usually a 4-week lag. And when with ESSER, the money, the reimbursements were big, like $40 million, so now I think we average about $5 to $6 to $8 million a month, and without ESSER. So, but for small districts, that's hard, because if you don't have captured verbs, and it's hard to spend the money and then wait to be reimbursed.
President
thank
Bolton
you.
kind of, sorry.
Go ahead.
President Bolton kind of hit on this, but how does the voucher program affect the state funding formula and state funding in general?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I was looking at this earlier today. So it used to be where we would get the money for all the kids, and then they would take money away through like a tuition expense. And so the complaint was that we'd get funded $3,000 per kid, but they would take out $7,000 per. So they would take the state share, which meant they were taking our local property taxes with them. With us, so we felt. So they took them out of the formula, and they're direct funding them now. That if you go to any of those ODE website reports, I pulled up Cincinnati College Prep Academy because it's just one I'm familiar with. They're getting an average of $8,100 or $8,200 per student. Sorry, while we're getting $3,000 per student. So that's the impact. That's community, not vouchers. I apologize. I didn't look up voucher program. It's not pass-through funding, so I don't have that data on a regular basis. But we can certainly get some more details and bring it back to the next, just as Jen. Make a note of that.
Thank you, Jen. And our next question is about charter schools as well, and voucher programs. We see our funding formula and where our funds come from. For a lot of charter schools, do they also get a lot of property tax as well? Are they eligible for property taxes?
No, they're not taxing entities, so that's why they get the higher state share. So the state collects the money and then allocates it out to the charter school at 88,000. That particular one's 8,000. So I'm assuming most of the charter schools are around that $8,000 mark, which would be our base cost, even though that's not what we get. So because they can't raise their own funds, they get the higher value.
One thing also, Jen, and I think you can kind of speak to this really quickly as well, is for the vouchers, the way it used to be set up was based on, the idea was that there was a percentage based on your ability to pay. So your wealth as an individual determined what the voucher was towards the cost of your student. And now with that somewhat removed in the sense of who's eligible, that also has changed how much revenue goes out the door towards vouchers, and takes away from revenue that could be utilize in the public school systems.
Well, and here's a failure of the system. I'm gonna call it a failure of the system because students get a voucher and they're there, we pay for that voucher for 13 years if they start in kindergarten. When the student, so we get a lot of movement between charter schools and voucher students. So the vouchers, the student may misbehave or they're not performing properly. They get kicked out of that school and they come back to CPS. Well, CPS has to remediate that student because a lot of times they leave us, they go there, they come back. And this is what I'm hearing from teachers. They've lost instruction, they've lost knowledge while they left. And so we have to spend time catching them back up and reacclimating them. And that takes time and money to do that. And so I've asked before, and I'm not sure if anybody's had the ability to do it yet, but to do some data analysis on students who come back to us mid-year. And then we have a short period of time. They may not count for us in that current year on the tax testing data, but they're certainly going to count in the next one. So if we can't catch them up and keep them on track, get them back on track, that hurts our report card.
I think the other thing is the failure of some of the charter schools to stay in business also means students who are getting partial educations throughout a year will come back, a half a year behind or a year behind their education. The other mark I think that is very much true is that private schools have the ability to reject students. And so the students are more likely to reject or not accept are the students who have the greatest cost to educating them per dollar.
Right. So,
We are wrapping up. We have 3 minutes left. One quick question. Does the state report card affect state funding at all?
no,
That was an easy answer.
it
There we
doesn't.
go.
The state report card does show financial information on it though. So if you're interested in looking, it compares similar districts, how much money is spent in the classroom versus outside the classroom. It's very bizarre to compare because all funds are being used. So we'll give you an example. ESSER is included in that data from last year. And so if we use a lot of our ESSER money on building and not instruction, if another district used a lot of their ESSER money in instruction, it would certainly sway that data so it looks different. And so you have to be really careful about how you compare. But I did an analysis of us and the urbans, how much money we spent per pupil versus the performance index. And we had the highest performance index and the lowest spend per pupil. So it shows us that we're more efficient in our spending for academic progress. Got a lot of room to grow, but we're getting there. We're moving in the right direction.
All right. Thank you so much, Jen. I don't have any more questions. You wanna close this out?
I will defer to our finance chair to close this out, if you will. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And again, I think the important things to take away from this information, and again, we'll see a little bit more of this on the following Just Ask Jen sessions there, is that there are only so many ways to fund a public school district in the state of Ohio. And so we are working very hard with the dollars that we have and working very hard to make sure that the dollars that are allocated to us continue to get allocated to us and that we use them in the best way possible. So as always, I appreciate all the hard work the treasurer and her team have done. Thank you, Michael Gusted and Kevin Ashley, for joining us also.
Yes.
And, let's hopefully have more of these type of conversations to really educate our community.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Michael and Kevin, for giving us your evening time. And
It's
Rob
our
for always
pleasure.
being there to help us.
Always my
All right.
pleasure. Have a good night, everyone.
All right, good night, everyone. Thank you.